August 17th, 1998, Moscow. Sergei Kiriyenko goes on television. Russia defaults. The ruble breaks. Banks stop pretending. Savings are trapped. Imports vanish. Wages become a rumor. A man may know how to repair engines and still fail, because the real asset is not skill. It is access. This is not fiction. This was Russia, 1998. And here's the part most people get wrong. They think collapse rewards competence, that if you can fix, weld, sew, diagnose, drive, account, build, or improvise, you will be fine. Sometimes, but not first. First collapse rewards position. On August 17, the state widened the ruble corridor to 60 to 9. 5 per dollar, moved to restructure domestic debt, and imposed a 90-day moratorium on parts of the banking system's external obligations. That sounds technical. It was not technical in lived reality. It meant the channel between work and survival had started to break. The Bank of Russia later called that statement a watershed. The World Bank's household analysis was blunter. For most Russians, the impact was disastrous. Real incomes fell. Poverty rose. Commercial bank collapse deprived people of hard-earned savings. That is the thesis of this film. When money, wages, and bank balances fail, survival shifts away from earned income and toward control over immediate necessities: food, heat, medicine, fuel, water, transport, information, protection, not wealth on paper, reach. And that changes the meaning of skill. If you repair engines but cannot source belts, bearings, oil, or payment you can trust, your skill is stranded. If you are a pharmacist without imported stock, you are not a healer. You are a witness to an empty shelf. If your salary exists only as an electronic promise inside a failing bank, you are employed on paper and cut off in practice. This is the official story versus the forensic record. The official story says the crisis was a financial event, a currency event, a debt event, but on the street, it was a conversion event. What could still become bread? What could still become antibiotics? What could still become winter heat? That is where we start. So let's go to Yekaterinburg, not to the stock exchange, to the plots, because one of the quietest facts of the Russian 1990s is that food security did not sit mainly inside supermarkets. It sat in strips of land outside the city. Dacha plots, garden plots, household plots, small pieces of ground held long before August 1998 made the evening news. And that distinction matters. People say Russians grew their own food. That phrase is too soft. Too late. Food was not simply grown. It was pre-positioned. Before the default, millions of households already had some combination of land use rights, seed stock, hand tools, jars, fences, relatives, and a way to get out there on weekends. By the late 1990s, small dacha, household, and garden plots cultivated only about 6% of agricultural land, yet produced more than half the total value of Russian agricultural output. According to a land law review citing Russian data, that is not a hobby sector. That is a parallel survival system, and the pattern reaches backward. A 1998 study by Grigory Affe noted that no fewer than 60% of Russian urbanites used some form of summer dwelling outside the city, with land attached for cultivation. So when formal wages broke, many households were not inventing resilience. They were drawing on an old one. That is the mechanism, not skill in the abstract, position in the chain of conversion. If you lived in a tower block with no plot, no relatives with a plot, no seeds, no cellar, no transport, and no relationship to a local market, then your cooking skill did not create potatoes. Your discipline did not create onions. Your work ethic did not create cucumbers in jars by October. Access did, and the forensic record is explicit about the role of these plots. FAO's review of Russian food security described private plots as a buffer mechanism against poverty. World Bank research on coping strategies in the post-Soviet space describes subsistence, or garden agriculture becoming the mainstay of many household economies when formal systems stopped carrying the load. Now notice the hidden filter. Two families can live in the same city. Both can work. Both can save. Both can have useful skills. But when the rupture comes, one family has a patch of land, a grandmother who knows what to plant, a brother with a car, and jars already washed in the shed. The other does not. That is not a difference in virtue. It is a difference in bottleneck control. And once you see that, the rest of the crisis starts to look different. Because the next bottleneck was not food in the soil. It was everything that had to be sourced. Now take that same logic from food and apply it to repairs. This is where a lot of viewers make the wrong leap. They hear crisis and imagine the practical man suddenly becoming king. The mechanic, the electrician, the machinist, the pharmacist. And yes, those skills matter, but only after supply survives long enough to meet them, because repair is not magic. It is assembly under constraint. A man can know engines perfectly and still stare at a dead machine, not because he forgot the craft, because the belt is imported, the bearing is imported, the lubricant is imported, the payment chain is broken, the wholesaler wants cash. The cash has already lost value by the afternoon. That was the real terrain. The Soviet system never built a modern pharmaceutical and medical technology base comparable to the West. World Bank research notes that it remained dependent on imported medicines and equipment from Eastern Europe or South Asia. So when the 1998 devaluation hit, access did not fail evenly. It failed at the import edge first. And the pharmaceutical record is especially revealing. A World Bank health sector review noted that the 1998 financial crisis actually helped domestic drug producers by making imported medicines prohibitively expensive. That is a dry sentence. Its street meaning is brutal. The imported stock was still medically needed, but the channel to obtain it had become too expensive or too unstable for ordinary use. So what happens inside a city like Moscow when the formal channel breaks? Not instant self-sufficiency. Substitution. Cannibalization. Informal routing. The mechanic strips one dead machine to keep another alive. The pharmacist hunts for domestic substitutes, half-supplied shelves, private connections. The wholesaler, with access to transport, customs, storage, or hard currency inventory, becomes more important than the man with technical skill, but no stock. That is the hierarchy reversal. And you can see the broader structure in food processing, too. Grigory Affe noted that parts of Russian food manufacturing were heavily import-dependent, with some branches around 50% dependent on imports. After the August 1998 devaluation, smaller regional producers were hit especially hard. So even where labor and know-how existed, the missing input still dictated terms. This is the part the official story flattens. It says the crisis was about prices, but prices were only the surface signal. Underneath was a distribution test. Who could still source? Who had stock? Who had a cousin in wholesale, a driver, a hard currency stash, a backroom supplier, a tolerated informal route? That person was not rich in the usual sense, but in the real sense for a season he was powerful. And once formal sourcing breaks, another asset rises fast. Not morale, not optimism. Trust. Now we move from inventory to people. Because once shelves thin out and banks become conditional, trust stops being a virtue. It becomes infrastructure. Argentina in 2001 is useful here because the collapse was not just monetary. It was relational. Javier Alliero, in Patience of the State and earlier work on poor people's political networks in Argentina, showed something uncomfortable. What middle-class observers dismissed as patronage or dependency often functioned on the ground as an actual distribution system for food, for medicine, for information, for credit, sometimes for physical safety. Bureau's point was not that these networks were noble, it was that they were real, and when formal systems faltered, reality won. That matters more than ideology, because in a breakdown, you do not live inside abstract rights. You live inside channels. Who tells you which pharmacy still has insulin? Who warns you that a road is blocked? Who extends a sack of flour on trust? Who lets you pay next week? Who tells you which official is actually processing claims? Who makes one phone call and gets your name moved up the list? That is not emotional support. That is logistics. And here is the mistake skilled, self-reliant people often make. They believe competence is portable, that you can simply arrive with your useful skill and convert it into what you need. Sometimes you can, but usually not at first. First, someone has to vouch for you. Someone has to route you. Someone has to tell you which promises still mean something in that neighborhood and which do not. Ayero's forensic value is that he strips away the polite fiction. He shows poor Argentines not as passive victims or romantic resistors, but as people navigating waiting rooms, brokers, queues, favors, referrals, threats, and selective access. The system did not disappear. It changed shape. It became personal, discretionary, and uneven. That is what many viewers underestimate. When institutions weaken, impersonality weakens with them. Rules do not necessarily vanish. They localize, and once that happens, the person with 3 trusted relationships can be richer in practical terms than the person with 10 times the bank balance and no entry point into local distribution. Read that carefully. Your network is not your social life. It is your map of surviving bottlenecks, and that brings us to the bottleneck beneath almost all the others. Food matters. Medicine matters. Trust matters. But in prolonged breakdown, one control point starts deciding whether all 3 can function. Energy. Venezuela makes this brutally clear. People talk about hyperinflation because numbers are easy to film. Stacks of notes. Prices rewritten by hand. Zeros added, then removed. But the deeper bottleneck was not arithmetic. It was power. Fuel. Water pressure. Cold storage. Between 2016 and 2019, hospitals, pharmacies, households, and small businesses did not just face currency destruction. They faced routine interruptions in electricity, water service, transport, and fuel availability. And once that happens, every other practical skill becomes conditional. A nurse without refrigeration cannot preserve medicine. A shopkeeper without power cannot keep stock. A technician without diesel cannot move. A family with a water pump but no electricity does not have water. They have equipment. That is the hierarchy. Energy first, then conversion. Now put that beside Weimar Germany. The cliché says hyperinflation rewarded practical people. The craftsman, the industrious clerk, the man with useful hands. Not exactly. What the forensic record shows is harder. During inflation, those closest to food, fuel, and tradable output gained bargaining power over those paid in fixed salaries or trapped in monetary claims. Farmers could delay sale. Producers with real goods could reset terms. Clerks in salaried households watched their stored claims evaporate between payday and purchase. Skill mattered, but location in the chain mattered more. A craftsman in a city still needed inputs. Coal, metal, leather, customers who could pay in something real. Without that, skill did not disappear. It decayed into underused capacity. Meanwhile, the person nearest potatoes, firewood, eggs, milk, or any output another household could consume immediately did not need to be eloquent, educated, or financially sophisticated. He needed leverage. That is the reversal most people resist. Collapse does not automatically elevate the most capable. It elevates the most connected to physical throughput. To the field, to the fuel line, to the warehouse, to the transformer that still works, to the cousin who can move goods at night, to the farmer who can say no for 3 more days. And if you are one step removed from those choke points, your experience of crisis is dependency. Not because you are lazy, not because you failed to learn, because your competence sits downstream from a closed valve, which means the modern danger is not only inflation, it is separation. Separation from your own claims on stored value. That is why Greece in 2015, Cyprus in 2013, and Argentina's corralito matter to you even if you never expect famine, because the first shock in a modern system is often not empty land. It is inaccessible claims. In Cyprus, insured language did not prevent deposit seizure above the threshold. In Greece, ATM controls turned account balances into rationed access. In Argentina, the corralito taught a generation that money in the bank and money in the hand are separated by policy, not by vocabulary. That is the modern form of the same old pattern. You are told you have assets, then the mechanism changes. Then you discover you have permissions, and permissions can be narrowed overnight. So the conversion question is the only one that survives contact with history. What in your life can still be turned into food, heat, medicine, transport, information, or protection if institutions remain open in name but closed in practice? Not net worth, not resume lines, not the number on a screen. Conversion. Can your savings leave the channel that can be frozen? Can your household function for a period without just-in-time resupply? Do you know who has real inventory, real tools, real land, real fuel, real local knowledge? What do you control directly? What do you merely access by permission? That is not paranoia. It is historical literacy. And let me be precise. Skill still matters deeply. But in the forensic record, skill does not save you first. Skill becomes decisive only after access is secured. So the binary choice is simple. Either you sit near a real bottleneck in physical life, food, energy, water, transport, medicine, repair, local trust, tradable output, or you depend on those who do when institutional promises break. That choice exists before the headline, before the cues, before the announcement on television. That is when it must be made.